In a world where people often measure worth by money, fame, or the kind of car someone drives, there are only a few who quietly walk their own path. Keanu Reeves was one of them. Despite being one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood, he lived in a way that surprised many. He didn't care for luxury or constant attention. He never tried to impress anyone. His life was simple, almost too simple for a man of his status. If you saw him on the street, you might not even realize who he was. No expensive clothes, no bodyguards, no crowd following him, just a man in a black jacket, riding the subway like everyone else, holding a cup of coffee, lost in his thoughts. He'd often give up his seat for someone older or someone who looked tired. And while people secretly took photos or whispered, "That's Keanu Reeves," he never made a big deal about it. He just smiled politely and carried on. In an industry filled with glitter and ego, Keanu stood out, not because he shouted for attention, but because he didn't. And strangely, that bothered some people. There were those who couldn't understand why someone so rich and famous didn't act like it. To them, success meant showing it off, wearing designer suits, hosting parties, and being seen in the right places. But Keanu didn't care for that world. He'd rather spend an evening reading a book, taking a quiet walk, or sitting with friends over simple food. There was one particular evening that showed the world just who Keanu really was. It started like any other night in Hollywood. Lights flashing, expensive cars pulling up to a grand hotel, and a long red carpet leading to an exclusive dinner party. The event was meant to celebrate a film's success. Everyone who was somebody in the business was invited: actors, producers, directors, and agents. It was the kind of place where people came not just to enjoy, but to be seen. When Keanu's name appeared on the guest list, many were surprised. He rarely showed up at such gatherings. He usually preferred quiet dinners with the film crew, or spending time with fans who happened to meet him by chance. But this time, a close friend, one of the producers, had personally requested him to come. Out of respect, Keanu agreed. While most stars arrived in luxury cars, Keanu showed up in a simple sedan, wearing a dark blazer and his usual scuffed boots. No flashy watch, no jewelry, no crowd of photographers waiting for him. He parked his car himself, walked to the entrance, and smiled at the security guard who checked his name on the list. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was buzzing. Waiters moved around with trays of champagne, laughter filled the air, and conversations about new projects and upcoming deals floated across the tables. The moment Keanu entered, heads turned. Some smiled genuinely. Others raised their eyebrows, whispering to one another. "Look who decided to show up," someone said quietly, half amused. "Wow, he didn't even hire a stylist, did he?" another voice joked. A small group of younger actors near the bar chuckled, making light comments about how out of touch he seemed. They spoke loudly enough for others to hear, but pretended it was all in fun. Keanu heard them, but his face didn't change. He simply smiled at the waiter who offered him a drink and thanked him softly. He made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and greeting everyone kindly. There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt to stand above anyone. He asked people how they were doing, listened when they spoke, and remembered little details from past meetings. It wasn't a show. It was who he truly was. At one point during the evening, the host invited everyone to sit down for dinner. The tables were beautifully decorated with flowers, candles, and crystal glasses that sparkled under the lights. Keanu found his seat a bit off to the side, next to a few executives and a rising young actor who clearly wanted to impress everyone around him. The conversation started with usual small talk about the latest films, box office numbers, new cars, and vacation homes. When Keanu was asked about his recent projects, he spoke humbly, praising the crew and the stunt team more than himself. While others talked about awards and red carpets, Keanu quietly mentioned how proud he was of the people who worked behind the scenes, the ones who rarely got credit. Some at the table smiled politely. Others, especially the young actor, found his modesty strange. "You're too humble, man," the actor said with a laugh. "Come on, you're a legend. You should own it." "If I were you, I'd be living in a mansion in Malibu." Keanu just smiled. "A house is just a roof over your head," he said softly. "Peace of mind matters more." The actor laughed again, not realizing how true those words were. He looked at another guest and joked, "Guess that's easy to say when you're rich enough to buy peace." A few people laughed, but the joke didn't land well. Keanu didn't react. He simply took a sip of water and changed the topic. Throughout the evening, Keanu stayed the same, calm, kind, and thoughtful. He didn't try to impress anyone, didn't speak over others, and didn't brag. While some continued to whisper or make comments about his simplicity, others began to notice something different about him. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, the kind of peace that comes from knowing who you are. Later, when dessert was served, the host raised a glass to thank everyone for coming. He began to talk about the importance of generosity and kindness in the industry. That's when one of the guests, trying to make a light-hearted remark, turned to Keanu and said, "You're the humble one here, right? Do you ever even spend your money?" The question was meant as a joke, but the tone carried a hint of mockery. The table chuckled. Keanu looked at him, not angry, not embarrassed, just calm, and said quietly, "I try to spend it where it matters." Those words hung in the air for a moment. No one quite understood what he meant, but they felt something genuine behind them. He didn't explain further, didn't try to defend himself. He just smiled, thanked the waiter for the dessert, and went back to listening to the conversation. But something had shifted. The laughter grew quieter around him. A few people began to realize that maybe the man they were teasing wasn't the one out of touch. Maybe he saw life in a way they didn't yet understand. As the night went on, the crowd grew smaller. Some people left early, others stayed to chat. Keanu stayed until the end, helping an older crew member carry some leftover boxes to the back of the hall. Most people didn't even notice. For him, it wasn't about being seen. It was just the right thing to do. Outside, when the event was finally over, Keanu walked toward his car. The same young actor who had made jokes earlier caught up to him. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Hey, I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier. I was just joking." Keanu looked at him with a kind smile and said, "It's okay. I've learned that sometimes people laugh at what they don't understand, but kindness still matters." The actor nodded, unsure what to say. Keanu gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder and walked away into the cool night air. He didn't know that those simple words would stay with that young man for a long time. That night, while others went home to post pictures and talk about who they met, Keanu drove home quietly, stopping by a small food stand to buy a sandwich. He ate it sitting on a bench watching the city lights. To him, it was a good night, not because he impressed anyone, but because he stayed true to who he was. Little did he know that this small encounter at a dinner party, this quiet moment of grace in the face of mockery, would later become a story told again and again, reminding people everywhere that real strength doesn't need to shout. It simply shows itself in kindness, in patience, and in the ability to stay humble, no matter how high you climb. The night of the dinner party slowly faded into memory for most people who attended, but not for Keanu. For him, it was just another reminder of how easily people could judge what they didn't understand. He didn't hold anger in his heart, but he did think about how strange it was that kindness often looked like weakness to the world. The next morning, he woke up early, as he always did. The city was still quiet, and sunlight was just beginning to touch the tall buildings. He made himself a cup of coffee and looked out from his small apartment window. It wasn't a mansion with ocean views like many other stars owned. It was simple, peaceful, and his. He liked it that way. There were no loud parties, no flashing lights, just silence, space to breathe, and a place that felt real. After finishing his coffee, he went out for a walk. People on the street recognized him but didn't believe it was really him at first. He looked too ordinary. Jeans, old sneakers, and a cap pulled down over his face. When someone finally realized who he was, they came up shyly to ask for a picture. He smiled, said of course, and even thanked them afterward for being polite. Nay, but they struck a chord. People around him began to notice how much lighter life felt when they stopped pretending to be someone else. His presence reminded everyone that it was okay to be simple, okay to be kind, and okay not to chase perfection. That week, the weather turned unexpectedly bad. A sudden rainstorm hit the set. Everyone rushed to pack up equipment, trying to protect the cameras and lights. In the chaos, one of the assistants slipped and fell in the mud. Keanu, who was standing under a tent, ran over without a second thought. He helped the assistant up, covered them with his jacket, and made sure they were okay. His own clothes got soaked, but he didn't care. "Hey, it's just water," he said with a grin. "We'll dry." Someone caught that moment on video, not for publicity, just as a memory. But later, when it found its way online, people all over the world saw it. They saw a superstar helping a crew member without hesitation, without cameras or speeches, without ego. The comments poured in. This is what real class looks like. He's one of a kind. You can't fake kindness like that. Keanu never even knew the video had gone viral. He didn't spend much time online. He wasn't interested in fame through social media. He cared more about the small moments that never made it to the screen. A week later, after finishing the shoot, he decided to do something thoughtful. He quietly bought every crew member a small thank you gift. Nothing flashy, just something meaningful. For one person, it was a book they had once mentioned. For another, it was a pair of gloves they needed for the cold mornings. For others, he simply gave a handwritten note saying, "Thank you for your hard work." When people opened their gifts, they were touched. They realized that he had actually listened to them throughout the shoot, remembered their stories, their needs, their dreams. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the attention and care behind it. After filming wrapped up, the crew surprised him with a small farewell cake. They gathered around, cheering, thanking him for being not just a great actor but a great person. One of the lighting technicians said, "You made us all feel equal. No one here ever felt small." Keanu smiled and said, "That's because we're all part of the same story. A movie only works when everyone shines, not just one person." It was moments like these that showed his true heart. But not everyone understood him yet. There were still people who thought his quiet ways were strange, that maybe he was pretending, or using humility as an image. In Hollywood, people often couldn't believe that someone could be genuinely simple. They were used to seeing people act kind only when cameras were rolling. A few reporters even tried to test him, asking questions that hinted at mockery. "You don't live in a mansion. You don't wear designer brands. Don't you think you should enjoy your success more?" one asked during an interview. Keanu smiled as always. "I enjoy it," he said softly. "I just enjoy it differently." He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He never felt the need to explain that peace mattered more to him than possessions. He knew that in the end, material things faded, but how you treated people stayed in their hearts forever. A few months later, a magazine reached out, asking to do a story on his unusual lifestyle. They wanted to photograph him with expensive props, luxury cars, high-end clothes, to make the article more marketable. He politely declined. "That's not me," he said. "If people want to know who I am, they'll find it in my work, not in pictures of things I don't use." Instead of doing interviews, he spent that time visiting an old friend, a stuntman who had worked with him years ago and had recently been injured. He brought food, sat beside his hospital bed, and stayed for hours talking and laughing. The friend later shared the story online saying, "He didn't come to be seen. He came because he cared." And that became the theme of Keanu's life, doing things not to be noticed, but because they were right. People who met him even once would talk about him for years, not because of his fame, but because of how he made them feel, seen, respected, and valued. But behind all his kindness, there was something deeper, a quiet wisdom shaped by pain. He had seen life's dark sides. He had lost people he loved, faced loneliness, and learned that the world can be both beautiful and cruel. Maybe that's why he understood how much kindness mattered. Maybe that's why he never mocked or judged anyone. He knew that everyone was carrying something unseen. One evening, while sitting in a cafe after a long day, a stranger came up to him, a middle-aged man who looked nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said, "but I just want to thank you. Years ago, you stopped to talk to me on the subway when I was going through a rough time. You didn't know me, but you listened. That meant a lot." Keanu looked at him with surprise and warmth. "I remember that day," he said softly. "You were reading a book about mountain climbing, right?" The man smiled, amazed that Keanu remembered. They talked for a while, and when the man left, Keanu sat back quietly, sipping his coffee. He didn't think of himself as special. He just believed in small moments of connection. Every act of kindness he gave seemed to come back to him in unexpected ways. not as fame or praise, but as reminders that goodness still mattered in the world. By then, even the people who had once laughed at him had stopped. They realized that what they had mistaken for simplicity was actually depth. They saw that it takes real strength to stay humble in a world that rewards arrogance. Keanu never set out to teach anyone a lesson, but without meaning to, he did. He showed that the greatest power isn't in wealth or fame. It's in how gently you treat others, how calmly you carry yourself, and how kindly you walk through a noisy world without ever losing your peace. And that quiet lesson was one that would stay with everyone who crossed his path. Weeks passed and life for Keanu continued as usual. While the world talked about him, about his humility, his kindness, his calmness, he stayed focused on his work and his quiet way of living. Fame had stopped meaning much to him long ago. What really mattered was peace of mind and the ability to look at himself in the mirror every morning and feel that he had done right by others. But even for someone like Keanu, the world never stopped testing patience. One afternoon, he was invited to another big event, a private film gathering filled with producers, investors, and celebrities. It was one of those nights where everyone tried to outshine everyone else. Expensive clothes, luxury watches, fake smiles, the usual glitter of Hollywood. Keanu didn't go because he wanted to impress anyone. He went because a close friend of his and someone who had worked hard for years without recognition was being honored that night. It wasn't about fame or money for him. It was about showing support for a friend. He arrived in his usual quiet way. A dark suit, no stylist, no red carpet drama. He greeted the doorman, thanked the security staff, and entered the hall with a soft smile. Inside, the atmosphere was loud and full of energy. Music played in the background. People laughed loudly and camera flashes lit up the room every few seconds. When people noticed Keanu, whispers started again, but this time they were mixed. Some admired him, some still couldn't understand him. A few people even joked quietly, "There's the guy who doesn't spend money." They said it lightly, thinking it was harmless, but their laughter carried the same old tone of judgment. Keanu heard it. He always did. But as always, he chose to stay silent. He found his seat at a corner table and joined a small group that included a few actors, one young director, and a couple of producers. The conversation started light, about upcoming projects, new deals, and how fast Hollywood was changing. After a while, one of the producers looked at Keanu and said, "You know, man, I've always wanted to ask, why don't you ever act like the star you are? You could have everything, the biggest house, the best cars, luxury vacations, but you live like an ordinary person. Don't you ever want more?" The question wasn't cruel, but the tone carried a sense of disbelief, as if simplicity needed to be justified. Keanu took a sip of his water and smiled gently. "I have what I need," he said softly. "And I've learned that more doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the more you have, the less peace you find." The table went quiet for a moment. The young director leaned forward and asked curiously, "But aren't you afraid people might think you're strange? You don't promote yourself, you avoid fame, you don't even seem to care about trends." Keanu chuckled softly. "People already think I'm strange," he said, "but that's okay. I'd rather be strange for being kind than be normal for being cruel." The honesty in his voice made everyone pause. It wasn't arrogance. It was simple truth. There was no performance in his tone, just quiet confidence. Then came the moment that changed the mood of the evening completely. During dinner, one of the guests, a well-known actor known for his sharp humor, started making jokes about how being humble was just another kind of act. He laughed loudly and said, "These days everyone pretends to be humble to look good. Maybe that's the new style, fake simplicity." A few people laughed nervously, unsure whether to agree or not. The man looked at Keanu and added, "No offense, but I don't buy this whole humble hero thing. If you've made millions, you should live like it." The air grew heavier. Some people at the table shifted uncomfortably. They knew the man was testing Keanu, maybe even trying to embarrass him, but Keanu didn't get angry. He looked at the man calmly, his expression gentle. "It's not about pretending," he said softly. "It's about peace. You can have all the money in the world, but if you can't sleep at night with a quiet heart, what's the point? The man laughed again, but the sound was weaker this time. Easy to say when you already have everything, he muttered. Keanu nodded slightly. Maybe, he said, but I've also lost everything before. That's when I learned what really matters. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that came from real experience. Everyone at the table could feel it. The laughter stopped. The man who had made the jokes lowered his eyes, realizing he had crossed a line he didn't understand. For a while, no one said anything. Then the young director spoke softly. You've been through a lot, haven't you? Keanu gave a small nod. We all have, he said. Pain doesn't skip anyone, but how we deal with it, that's what defines us. The room around them continued buzzing with noise and laughter, but that small table had gone quiet, as if time itself had slowed down. People weren't looking at a movie star anymore. They were looking at a man who had truly lived, who had known both light and darkness, and who had chosen kindness every time. A few minutes later, the host came on stage to start the award ceremony. The lights dimmed and soft music played. Keanu's friend, the one being honored, was called up to receive the award. He gave a short, emotional speech, thanking his team and friends for believing in him. When he mentioned Keanu's name, the crowd clapped loudly. He's the kind of person who reminds you what goodness looks like, the man said from the stage. In this business, that's rare. Keanu smiled quietly, a bit embarrassed by the attention, and simply nodded. He never liked being praised in public. To him, doing the right thing was its own reward. After the ceremony, a few people came up to him apologizing for the jokes earlier. He shook their hands, smiled, and said, It's fine. We all see the world differently. That's what makes life interesting. Later that night, while everyone else left for the after party, Keanu quietly slipped out. He walked down the street alone, enjoying the cool air. The city was glowing, bright lights, cars rushing past, laughter echoing from bars and restaurants. But he liked the quiet corners, the places where no one noticed him. As he walked, he stopped at a small food cart and bought a sandwich. The vendor recognized him and smiled shyly. You're that actor, right? The man asked. Keanu nodded and said, Yeah, just a hungry one tonight. The vendor laughed and they talked for a bit. Before leaving, Keanu left a generous tip and told him, Take care of yourself, brother. The nights are long, huh? The vendor smiled warmly. You too, sir. God bless you. Keanu walked away, holding his sandwich, feeling light. These were the moments he cherished most, small, real human connections. The next morning, news spread again, not because of what he said or wore, but because someone from the event had shared a story online. They wrote about how calmly he had handled being mocked, how he had turned a moment of awkwardness into a lesson without raising his voice. People all over social media shared that story. They said things like, This is how you teach people, not by shouting, but by living differently. And they were right. Keanu hadn't set out to teach anyone anything that night, but just by being himself, by staying grounded, calm, and kind. He reminded everyone that respect doesn't need to be demanded. It is earned quietly, through how you treat people when they least deserve it. That evening, when his friend called to thank him for coming, Keanu simply said, You earned that award. I'm proud of you. He didn't mention the jokes, the stares, or the whispers. Those things didn't matter. What mattered was that he had supported a friend and stayed true to his nature. Later, sitting alone in his apartment, he thought about the evening, not with bitterness, but with a kind of gentle reflection. He knew that life would keep testing him, and people would keep misunderstanding him. But he also knew that he had made peace with who he was long ago. He didn't need everyone to understand him. He just hoped that, little by little, his actions might make people think differently, not about him, but about how they treated others. And without realizing it, that's exactly what was happening. Quietly, one heart at a time, Keanu's kindness was changing the way people looked at fame, success, and humanity. Because sometimes the greatest lessons are not shouted from a stage. They're whispered through small acts of kindness that speak louder than words ever could. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The story of Keanu's calm nature, his humility, and the way he handled everything with kindness continued to travel quietly from person to person. People who had once mocked him now spoke of him with respect. They realized that he wasn't trying to prove a point. He was just living his truth. And that truth had touched more hearts than any movie ever could. But Keanu himself stayed exactly the same. He didn't change his lifestyle, didn't chase the new wave of fame that came from those stories. He still rode the subway sometimes, still smiled at strangers, still helped people without anyone knowing. To him, kindness wasn't a strategy. It was simply how life should be lived. One cold evening after finishing a shoot, he decided to take a quiet walk through the city. The streets were glowing under soft yellow lights. People hurried past, lost in their own worlds, some tired from work, others laughing with friends. Keanu liked to observe people that way. It reminded him that everyone was living their own story, carrying their own struggles, dreams, and worries. He stopped at a small park, bought a cup of coffee from a street vendor, and sat on a bench. It was one of those peaceful moments that didn't need anything grand to feel complete. As he sat there, he saw an older man nearby struggling to fix the chain of his bicycle. Keanu didn't think twice. He stood up, walked over, and asked, "Need a hand?" The man looked up and recognized him instantly. His eyes widened in surprise. You're that movie actor," he stammered. Keanu smiled and said, "Yeah, but right now I'm just a guy who knows a bit about bike chains." They both laughed. Keanu knelt down, fixed the chain with a little effort, and wiped his hands on a tissue the man handed him. When the man tried to thank him again and again, Keanu just waved it off. "It's nothing," he said. "Just be careful when you ride home." After the man left, Keanu sat back on the bench, thinking about how small gestures could make someone's day. He didn't need to donate millions every time. Sometimes kindness was as simple as helping a stranger without expecting anything back. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, more people started to share their experiences with him. Makeup artists, crew members, even extras who had worked with him for just a day. They all told similar stories, how he remembered their names, how he treated everyone equally, how he stayed behind to help clean up after shoots. A young assistant who once worked on his film wrote online, "He treated me like a friend, not an employee. One day I was feeling down and he noticed. He didn't ask why. He just gave me a small chocolate bar and said, 'Sweet things help when life feels bitter.' I've never forgotten that." That post reached millions of people. They didn't just see him as a movie star anymore. They saw him as a reminder that decency still existed in a world that often forgot it. Despite all the admiration, Keanu remained as humble as ever. When journalists tried to ask about these stories, he never took credit. He always said, "I just try to be a good person, that's all." But the truth was, his goodness was changing people around him. The young actor who once mocked him at that first dinner had become a completely different person. Inspired by Keanu, he had started volunteering at shelters and helping small charities. He later said in an interview, "He didn't lecture me. He just showed me another way to live, and it made me want to be better." That's the thing about true kindness, like it spreads quietly. You don't even realize it's happening until one small action grows into something much bigger. A few months later, Keanu was invited to speak at a film school for young students. He didn't usually do public talks, but he agreed because he wanted to share something meaningful. The auditorium was packed. Students looked at him with admiration, not just for his career, but for the person he had become in their eyes. When he walked on stage, he looked a little shy. He wasn't used to giving speeches. He scratched his chin, smiled at the crowd, and said, "I'm not a teacher, so don't expect anything fancy. I just want to share what life has taught me." The room went silent, everyone listened carefully. He continued, "People often think success means fame or money, but I've learned it's not about what you have. It's about who you are when no one's watching. It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you. It's about keeping your heart soft even when the world tries to harden it." The students clapped softly, but he held up his hand and smiled. "Don't clap yet," he said. "There's something else." You'll meet people who laugh at your simplicity, who think being kind makes you weak. Let them think what they want. Just don't change. Because the world needs more kindness. Not more cleverness, not more pride. Just kindness. When he finished speaking, there was a long, thoughtful silence before the entire hall broke into applause. Some students had tears in their eyes. It wasn't a grand or emotional speech. It was simple, but it came straight from the heart. After the event, he stayed behind, taking pictures with students, answering questions, and giving small bits of advice. He didn't rush to leave or act like he was too important. One student nervously asked, "What's the secret to staying kind in a world that can be so cruel?" Keanu smiled and said, "There's no secret. You just decide every day that you'll be gentle, no matter how rough life gets. It's a choice, not a talent." That line stayed with everyone who heard it. A few days later, one of the professors from that school wrote an article online about his visit. The professor said, "He didn't come to inspire us with fame. He came to remind us of humanity." That article spread quickly, touching hearts everywhere. Back in his own quiet world, Keanu continued with his routine, reading, walking, working, helping when he could. Fame came and went like waves, but his peace stayed constant. He didn't need approval anymore. He had already found what he had been looking for, a life of meaning, not noise, and yet he never saw himself as a saint or a hero. Whenever people praised him, he simply said, "I'm just trying to be decent." That's something anyone can do. One evening, he was having dinner with a few old friends. They laughed, shared stories, and talked about how the industry had changed. At one point, one of his friends said, "You know, people talk about you like you're some kind of legend of kindness. Doesn't it feel strange?" Keanu smiled and said, "If people talk about kindness, I'm okay with that. We could use more of it in the world." Everyone at the table nodded quietly. There was a sense of peace in his words, a truth that needed no decoration. That night, when he went home, he looked out of his window at the quiet city lights. He thought about how far life had taken him, through pain, loss, success, and love. He had seen people at their best and worst, and after everything, he still believed in goodness. He knew the world wouldn't always be kind. He knew there would always be people who mocked simplicity, who confused quietness for weakness. But he also knew that somewhere deep inside, everyone carried a little spark of kindness. They just needed someone to remind them it was still there. And if his life, in all its simplicity, could remind even one person to be a little gentler, a little softer, a little more patient, then that was enough. Because true kindness doesn't need noise or recognition. It doesn't need to be proved or posted. It lives quietly in small moments, and a helping hand, a soft word, a smile to a stranger. And that's how Keanu chose to live. Not to be perfect, but to be kind. In a world full of noise, he had become a quiet lesson. When others mocked him for being simple, he didn't argue. He just kept being himself. And in the end, that was the greatest lesson he could ever teach. That kindness, even when ignored or mocked, never goes to waste. It always finds its way back in ways no one can predict. And that's how Keanu Reeves, the man who never wanted to be more than human, taught the world that true greatness isn't about power or fame. It's about staying gentle in a world that sometimes forgets how to be. He didn't preach it. He lived it, and that made all the difference.